General William Westmoreland was the chief architect of America's military strategy during the Vietnam War. Commanding with firm resolve from 1964 to 1968, he believed victory could be achieved through overwhelming force and a strategy of attrition aimed at crushing the Viet Cong. However, the course of the war shifted dramatically with the battles of Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive. As morale collapsed on the American home front and support within South Vietnam weakened, Westmoreland's emphasis on battlefield statistics failed to convince a growing nation that the cost was justified. Despite military dominance in combat, his legacy became clouded by doubt and the looming perception of defeat. This is the story of William Westmoreland, the man often blamed for losing the Vietnam War. William Westmoreland's rise began in Spartanburg County, South Carolina, where he was born to Eugenia Tally Childs and James Ripley Westmoreland. Raised in a family closely tied to local banking and the textile industry, his path toward prominence emerged early. At just 15 years old, he achieved the rank of Eagle Scout in Troop 1 of the Boy Scouts, earning prestigious honors such as the Distinguished Eagle Scout Award and the Rare Silver Buffalo. These early accomplishments revealed a strong sense of leadership and ambition that hinted at an exceptional future. After spending a year at the Citadel in 1932, Westmoreland secured admission to the United States Military Academy through the support of Senator James F. Burns, a family friend. At West Point, his curiosity and discipline placed him among a distinguished class that included future leaders such as Creighton Abrams and Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Graduating as first captain, the highest cadet rank, he was awarded the Pershing Sword for military excellence. Beyond academics and command, he also contributed to Protestant Sunday school leadership, reflecting his broad sense of responsibility. Upon graduating in 1936, he began his career in artillery assignments at Fort Sill and Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. During World War II, he demonstrated his abilities across campaigns in Tunisia, Sicily, France, and Germany. Rising to the rank of colonel, he became Chief of Staff of the 9th Infantry Division. After the war, he completed airborne training, commanded the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and served as Chief of Staff of the 82nd Airborne Division. Westmoreland's career continued with advanced education at the Army Command and General Staff College and the Army War College. He later commanded the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team during the Korean War and even participated in a management program at Harvard Business School. His service extended beyond combat roles as he became Secretary of the Army's General Staff, Commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Superintendent of the United States Military Academy, and Commander of the 18th Airborne Corps. In recognition of his accomplishments, he was inducted as an honorary member of the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati in 1962. The roots of the Vietnam conflict stretched back to the post-World War II era, when France attempted to reassert control over Vietnam but suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Conference sought to resolve the crisis in Indochina and temporarily divided Vietnam into two regions, the North under Communist leadership and the South under the State of Vietnam, led by former Emperor Bao Dai. Although the final declaration called for nationwide elections by July 1956 to reunify the country, both South Vietnam and the United States rejected the plan. Global tensions deepened as communist powers such as China and the Soviet Union supported North Vietnam, while the United States and its allies backed the South. By the time Westmoreland took command in South Vietnam, the idea of a Korean-style settlement with a demilitarized zone had already been dismissed. Instead, American policy focused on achieving a decisive victory without dramatically increasing resources, largely due to fears of provoking Chinese intervention. North Vietnamese infiltration into the South posed a serious challenge, yet direct attacks against the North were avoided because of concerns over Chinese involvement. President Lyndon B. Johnson remained committed to defending South Vietnam, creating a strategic contradiction. Figures such as Army Chief of Staff Harold Keith Johnson and historian Harry G. Summers Jr. later pointed out that truly defeating communism would have required a national emergency and full-scale mobilization of U.S. resources, an approach fundamentally at odds with stated objectives. General Johnson criticized Westmoreland's leadership, believing he was overly focused on satisfying civilian officials. However, Westmoreland was adhering to long-standing military principles that emphasized deference to civilian authority. Throughout this period, fear of Chinese intervention encouraged a largely defensive posture, even as President Johnson publicly stressed the necessity of protecting Vietnam. Military strategy was also shaped by civilian experts who moved from academia into government positions. Many believed nuclear weapons had rendered traditional warfare obsolete, while counterinsurgency doctrine gained prominence and diminished the role of conventional combat. Following the Korean War, Americans were accustomed to conflicts ending in total enemy surrender, a pattern Vietnam would not follow. Everything changed after the Gulf of Tonkin incident on August 2, 1964, which propelled the United States into the Vietnam War at full speed. By the end of that year, nearly 200,000 American troops had been deployed. Westmoreland now faced a complex battlefield shaped by the dual structure of the Viet Cong insurgency and the regular North Vietnamese army, including troops secretly crossing borders in preparation for large-scale offensives. Westmoreland viewed the situation as an urgent threat. At the same time, the Viet Cong had entrenched themselves deeply within populated coastal regions, creating constant instability through guerrilla warfare. Influenced by Robert McNamara's reliance on statistics, Westmoreland focused heavily on body counts and used battles such as the Battle of Ia Drang to argue that communist forces were steadily losing ground. However, the U.S. government, determined to secure victory without sustaining excessive losses, grew concerned when McNamara's data suggested the possibility of significant American casualties. This concern forced policymakers to reconsider what was realistically achievable in the war. One of the most significant moments in Vietnam's turmoil was the Battle of Ia Drang, a unique and defining event in the Vietnam War. It marked the first major confrontation in which U.S. troops faced a large enemy force directly. Following consultations with junior officers, General Johnson began questioning the effectiveness of localized, short-term search and destroy missions. Communist forces had the advantage of choosing when and where to fight, often avoiding direct engagement with U.S. troops whenever it suited their strategy. The alternative, conducting sustained pacification operations across the entire country, would have required a massive deployment of American forces and was never politically feasible for General Westmoreland. Despite these limitations, he publicly maintained an optimistic view of the war's progress. Critics, including journalist James Warren, later argued that Westmoreland's reliance on attrition warfare overstated his leadership effectiveness. When General Creighton Abrams assumed command, there was a deliberate move away from pure attrition tactics. Abrams's early operations achieved tactical success in disrupting North Vietnamese activities, but battles such as Hamburger Hill proved politically damaging. These events significantly restricted Abrams's ability to continue similar large-scale operations. Westmoreland was deployed to Vietnam in 1963, and by January 1964 he had become Deputy Commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. His reputation quickly drew the attention of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who praised him to President Lyndon B. Johnson in April, calling Westmoreland the best we have, without question. As commander of MACV, Westmoreland gained widespread recognition for his optimistic assessments of U.S. military performance, which received extensive media coverage. However, as communist forces continued to grow in the South, Westmoreland repeatedly requested additional American troops. When he first arrived, U.S. forces numbered around 16,000, but by 1968, when he became Army Chief of Staff, that number had surged to approximately 535,000. On April 28, 1967, Westmoreland delivered a critical address to a joint session of Congress. He emphasized the importance of national resolve, stating that in evaluating enemy strategy, it was clear the enemy believed America's Achilles heel was its resolve. He stressed that unwavering support from the American public was essential, declaring that continued strong backing was vital to the mission's success. Westmoreland highlighted the qualities he believed were necessary for victory, including resolve, confidence, patience, determination, and sustained support. He expressed confidence that the United States would prevail over the communist threat, asserting that with strong backing at home, American forces would ultimately succeed. He also claimed that under his command, U.S. forces had won every major battle. According to Westmoreland, the war's true turning point came with the 1968 Tet Offensive, during which Communist forces launched widespread attacks across South Vietnamese cities and towns. At the time, his primary focus was on the Battle of Khe Sanh, which he viewed as a diversion intended to draw attention away from more significant strategic objectives. The relationship between Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive remains debated, often referred to as the Khe Sanh mystery. Some believe Khe Sanh was meant to distract from Tet, while others argue the opposite. Regardless, American and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the attacks, inflicting heavy losses on Communist troops. Despite these military outcomes, the scale and intensity of the Tet Offensive shattered public confidence in Westmoreland's earlier assurances about the war's progress. The resulting political debates and shift in public opinion led the Johnson administration to impose limits on further troop increases in Vietnam. Approximately 9 months later, when news of the My Lai massacre emerged, Westmoreland opposed attempts by the incoming Nixon administration to suppress the incident. Instead, he called for a full investigation led by Lieutenant General William Pierce. Notably, only days after the massacre, Westmoreland had praised the same unit for killing 128 communists during a fierce engagement. After 1969, Westmoreland also supported investigations into the Phong Nhi and Phong Not massacres, which had occurred the previous year. He remained convinced that Communist forces could be defeated through a war of attrition, gradually wearing down the Vietnam People's Army until it could no longer sustain the fight. His strategy depended heavily on artillery and air power, along with attempts to draw Communist forces into large-scale battles where U.S. firepower and technology would provide a decisive advantage. However, the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front pursued a different approach, maintaining a guerrilla war that avoided major confrontations and denied the Americans the opportunity to exploit their strengths. This strategy also sought to erode American public support more quickly. Despite recommendations from advisors such as John Paul Vann and Lew Walt to adopt a pacification-based approach, Westmoreland remained committed to attrition warfare. He struggled to persuade President Johnson to expand the conflict into Cambodia and Laos to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail and instead relied on what he described as positive indicators. These indicators proved misleading when the Tet Offensive caught both the military and the public by surprise. The offensive overshadowed Westmoreland's optimistic claims and triggered a sharp decline in U.S. support for the war. Although Communist forces suffered heavy losses at Khe Sanh and during Tet, and the United States and South Vietnam were in a stronger military position in early 1968, the political fallout and public panic ultimately weakened support for the war, creating what became known as the Quiet Controversy. In June of 1968, things took a turn for General Westmoreland when General Croton Adams stepped into his shoes. This switch-up came right after the Tet Offensive shook things up, while the decision had been in the works since late 1967. The media spun it as a bit of a slap on the wrist for not being fully prepared for the Communist attack. After that, Westmoreland took on the role of Chief of Staff of the United States Army from 1968 to 1972. In 1970, during his time as Chief of Staff, he responded to the My massacre by U.S. Army forces by launching an investigation. This deep dive into the leadership during the Vietnam War revealed a troubling trend of officers straying for the Army's core values of duty, honor, and country. This report, known as the Study on Military Professionalism, had a big impact on Army policies. One noticeable change was Westmoreland's decision to extend the service duration of officers in Vietnam beyond just 6 months, aiming to improve stability. However, to keep a lid on the negative findings, he kept the report under wraps within the Army for 2 years, only sharing it after he retired in 1972. Some military historians note that Westmoreland took the reins as Chief of Staff during a tough period for the Army, especially as it shifted to an all-volunteer force. He tried to make Army life more appealing to young Americans, allowing things like sideburns and beer in the mess hall, although not everyone was on board with these changes, labeling them as too lenient. After AS in the Army, Westmoreland dipped into politics, running for governor of South Carolina in 1974, albeit unsuccessfully. He also penned his autobiography and got involved in improving education standards in South Carolina. At one point, he even caught the eye of Time magazine as a potential contender for the 1968 Republican presidential nomination. The legal battles back in 1986 brought Westmoreland a pretty big honor. He was chosen as the Grand Marshal for the Chicago Vietnam Veterans Parade. It was a huge event, with around 200,000 Vietnam veterans and over 500,000 people showing up to watch, and this parade did a lot to mend the rift between Vietnam vets and the American public. Around that time, Mike Wallace had a chat with Westmoreland for a CBS special called The Uncounted Enemy of Vietnam Deception. This documentary, which aired on January 23 of 1982 and was mostly put together by CBS producer George Crow III, made some serious claims. It said that Westmoreland and others had purposely downplayed how many Viet Cong soldiers there were in 1967. They did this to keep up morale among us troops and keep support for the war strong back home. Westmoreland wasn't happy about what the documentary said, and he sued CBS, including Wallace, for saying things about him that he believed were lies. This turned into a long legal battle, but then during the trial, something surprising happened. Westmoreland and CBS settled suddenly. He got an apology, which was pretty much what CBS had offered from the start. Some folks think that the judge's instructions to the jury about proving that CBS acted with actual malice and saying those things about Westmoreland made his lawyers worry that they were going to lose the case. Others think the settlement happened after two of Westmoreland's old intelligence officers, Major General Joseph McChristian and Colonel Gaines Hawkins, backed up the main points of the documentary. These points were about Westmoreland challenging intelligence reports about Viet Cong troop numbers for political reasons. There's still a lot of debate about whether CBS's editors did the right thing. According to a statement by McChristian, his team had better intel on the number of irregular Viet Cong fighters just before he left Vietnam on a regular rotation. These numbers worried Westmoreland because he thought the media wouldn't understand them. He didn't tell anyone to change the numbers, but decided not to include them in reports to Washington, thinking they weren't suitable for sharing. Looking back at everything later, it seems clear that Westmoreland couldn't prove CBS wrong in court. The main claim CBS made was that he made intelligence officers hide the truth. Westmoreland was furious because the broadcast hinted that he was being dishonest and telling others to lie. During the intense trial, Mike Wallace ended up in the hospital with depression. Despite all the legal battles, Westmoreland and his wife even sent him flowers. Wallace's memoir is mostly understanding toward Westmoreland, although he makes it clear they disagreed on Vietnam War issues and Nixon's policies in Southeast Asia. Westmoreland's views on life and war came up back in 1998 during an interview with George magazine, when Westmoreland didn't hold back talking about his rival, North Vietnamese General V Nguyen Giap. He basically said yeah, Giap was tough, but he made some big mistakes. Westmoreland felt Giap stuck to old-school tactics that cost his own soldiers dearly. By early 1969, Giap had reportedly lost around 500,000 soldiers, a massive loss. Westmoreland thought this showed Giap wasn't a military genius, just someone who didn't value human life enough. Then there's this 1974 movie where Westmoreland made a controversial comment about how Westerners and Asians see life differently. He seemed to suggest that Westerners care more about life and dignity, but not everyone agreed with him. Nick Tur, who wrote a book about the Vietnam War, argued that many of the Vietnamese who died were innocent civilians, not enemy soldiers caught in the crossfire. Tur also accused Westmoreland of hiding the truth about what really happened from the public when he was in charge. Even after all the criticism, Westmoreland stood by his belief that the U.S. didn't lose the Vietnam War. He thought they just didn't fully support South Vietnam. This view got him into hot water with historians and experts who saw things differently. Westmoreland's personal life had its share of tragedies as well. Shortly after taking on a big role in the Army, his brother-in-law died in Vietnam. Westmoreland himself lived a long life, passing away in 2005 due to Alzheimer's. He was laid to rest with military honors, and various awards and memorials now honor his legacy, including the General William C. Westmoreland Bridge and an annual award recognizing veterans' contributions.